transparency in the functioning of these NGOs. The central government has come up with these FCRA amendments that we will discuss in this class. Okay. So the background, as I discussed, is that the Central Bureau of Investigation had submitted a report before the Supreme Court of India, and that report said that only, or even not even only, below 10% of the around 29 lakh registered NGOs across the country file their annual income and expenditure, right? So 90% of these, or roughly 30 lakh NGOs, do not file any sort of annual income and expenditure. So the government can in no way keep trace on who is giving them the money and how this money is being spent, right? Now obviously there is a threat that remains vis-a-vis foreign funding, etc., right? So let's say when a foreign entity gives an NGO certain sums of money, there are certain expectations that flow out of this transaction of money. So you couldn't assume that I mean, it's not unfair on the part of the government to assume that if there is foreign funding involved, the true intention of the NGOs might be something separate from general benefit, might be something which is different from helping the people and generating goodwill, etc. Right? Similarly, your intelligence bureau had also submitted a report which said that foreign aided NGOs are actively stalling developmental projects. For example, there are a lot of foreign funded NGOs which, for example, Greenpeace, etc., which generally help, let's say, gather support for your most vulnerable sections like tribals, etc., whenever their lands are being encroached for construction of a dam, or wherever their fields or lands are being encroached for the construction of highways, etc., right? Now obviously both the interests have to be matched. You have to give importance to the interest of the tribals, you have to give importance to the interest of forest dwellers, farmers, etc., but you also have to balance the interest of a growing India, right? So as India continues to grow, we need more highways, we need more railways, we need more dams, etc., right? So IB has said that because of these NGOs that are actively stalling developmental projects, whether the case might be genuine or not, there is a general impact of 2 to 3% in India's GDP. Okay. Now, therefore, the government has come up with the amendment to the FCRA. Okay. Now, there was an already existing act called the FCRA 2010. Okay. Now, the primary agenda of the FCRA is to regulate the acceptance and utilization of foreign contribution by any individual, association, or companies. Okay. Now, let's see what this amendment specifically talks about. The first point that it says is that prohibition to accept foreign contribution. Okay, so under the original act, which is the 2010 act, your election candidates, editors or publishers of newspapers, judges, government servants, members of any legislature, etc., they were prohibited to accept any sort of foreign contribution, right? So if you fall in the list, you will not uh, you will not be allowed to take any money from a foreign entity. Now, however, this amendment adds public servants to the list, right? So now if you are a public servant, which by definition means any person who is in any form of service or pay of the government, or is paid by the government for the performance of any public duty, that person also qualifies as a public servant. Now you necessarily don't have to be a government employee, right? So now if under the current amendment, if you're a public servant, if you're giving any sort of, let's say, services to the government and are getting paid for it, then also you cannot accept foreign contributions under the FCRA. Now, similarly, there is another provision which talks about transfer of foreign contribution. Okay, so under the act, foreign contribution cannot be transferred to any other person unless and until this person that you want to transfer the foreign contribution that you receive is also registered to accept the FCRA under the FCRA Act. So now this amendment says that you cannot transfer any sort of foreign contribution to any other person. If you get a foreign contribution, then you are supposed to use that foreign contribution on your own. You can't relend it to someone, or you can't send that money to some other NGO or some other particular person. Okay. Now, the another thing that this amendment talks about is that now you need an Aadhaar card or an OCI card or a passport for any sort of registration under the FCRA. Okay, so the amendment says that any person who wants to seek any sort of permission from the FCRA to get any sort of foreign funding, etc., now have to provide either the Aadhaar card of all the office bearers, director, etc., or if that person is a foreigner, then you have to provide the passport of the overseas citizen of India, a passport or the OCI card for identification. Without either of these three documents, you cannot be registered under the FCRA. Okay. Now, this, because the government wants to regulate the sort of money that is coming in, they have designated a specific account under this act. So the amendment says that now foreign contributions can be received only in a particular bank account known as the FCRA account in any branch of State Bank of India that the central government will, State Bank of India, New Delhi, that the central government will certify. Okay, so earlier on you could receive this foreign money in any account that you wanted. Now you will have to open a bank account with State Bank of India in New Delhi. This is done so that the government can keep track of the money that is flowing in. Now, after, once you've received this money, you can obviously use any other account. One second, no. So sorry for that. So once you receive this money, you can now you can send it to another account, etc. But the point of entry of this money into India has to be your SBI account in New Delhi. Okay. Further, there is a, 1 second. My voice is breaking. Is it that bad? Like, can you hear anything, or is it like a very big problem? So let me know if it happens again. And let's see what we can do about it. Okay. Now there is another restriction that is now being placed on foreign contribution. Okay. So let's say if I was a person who was working in an NGO and somehow I violate any of the provisions of the act, so there will be an inquiry on me, right? So if the inquiry is pending, then my NGO, to utilize any funds that I was handling, will now need the permission of the central government to handle the, to redistribute this money. Also, now the central government has the power to restrict the usage of any unauthorized foreign contribution based on a summary inquiry and pending a further detailed inquiry, right? So the government can come up with a very quick inquiry and then put a stop on that money. Furthermore, there is a clause pertaining to renewal of licensing. So under this act, now every person who's been given any sort of certificate of registration must renew the certificate within 6 months of expiration. So whenever that certificate expires, you can renew it within 6 months. Further on, the government says it also adds that the government can, at the renewal, so let's say a certificate has been given to you, and later on if you come to renew the certificate, the government can create a fresh inquiry as to whether all the conditions that have been specified in this act have been fulfilled or not. So the government, if you look at it, is basically having a stricter control so that they can scrutinize these NGOs with greater detail and in let's say with can sorry not in greater detail but to a greater extent and with greater depth. Okay. Second. So another very interesting amendment that has come up is the restriction in use of foreign contribution for administrative purpose. So under the old act, if an NGO was receiving, let's say, 100 rupees from abroad, it could use 50 rupees to give for administrative expenses such as salary, etc. Right? Now this amendment reduces this administrative expense to a mere 20% of the amount that you get in. The last thing that this amendment act also changes is that the government can now suspend the registration of a person for a period up to 360 days. So in the old act, the suspension could be for 180 days. Now another 180 days has been added to taking the total to 360 days. So you can effectively be barred from re-registration or suspended from registration for a period of 1 year. Okay. Now, obviously, there are certain concerns that have crept up with the sort of amendments that we see. The first would be fund accessibility, right? Now, because the practice of re-granting has been banned, as in one NGO received the foreign money, then it used to send that money to multiple other NGOs. Now, since this has been dealt with and this has been stopped, the smaller NGOs who generally used to receive money from the larger NGOs will now have a problem in accessing foreign funds. So that will be one issue. Then there is then the restriction of, let's say then the restriction of about restriction which imposes a 20% cap on administrative expenses has a problem for smaller NGOs, right? Let's say I am a smaller NGO and the primary expenses that I will have to fulfill would be renting a building, hiring people, paying them salaries, etc. Now, if I can only spend 20% of the amount that I receive, I can obviously not hire as many people and I cannot have enough staff. I can't hire experts, and then I will not be able to work very well in my particular field, right? Similarly, another issue is with the compulsion of Aadhaar. So the Supreme Court earlier had said that Aadhaar will not be compulsory for a list of activities. However, this sort of amendment goes against the principle of the Supreme Court judgment by saying that the Aadhaar card is compulsory. Okay. Now another let's say criticism was that this bill was not scrutinized. A draft bill was not placed in public, and it was just directly introduced in the Lok Sabha. And in the Lok Sabha also, there was not a lot of discussion. Now, obviously, the larger impact of all of this is I agree with the fact that there are certain malicious NGOs which might have certain anti-national agendas. You can curb them, you can monitor them. I agree with that. However, one of the problems is that there are a lot of other small NGOs, small well-meaning NGOs, which do a lot of work in the field of education, health, people's livelihoods, etc. And because of these stricter clauses and stricter restrictions, the functioning of those NGOs will be hampered. Okay. So this was pretty much it that you should be concerned about vis-a-vis NGOs and vis-a-vis the FCRA. So a lot of articles this year have been written on FCRA and on how there is a growing problem vis-a-vis, there's a fight, there's a turf war between the government of India and multiple NGOs. So you could expect a question from these. This has been written in a lot of environmental policy articles. This has been written in the Week, Frontline, Hindu, etc. So it's possible that you have a question along the FCRA and the role of NGOs. Okay, so read a little bit more about the sort of NGOs that exist in India, and you'll be able to do good if there's a question pertaining to this. Now, the second thing I want you to look at is the World Energy Outlook. So, International Energy Agency, which is an intergovernmental organization, has released the World Energy Outlook in 2020 in October 2020, obviously. Okay, so let's see what the IEA or the International Energy Agency is. So, first of all, IA is an intergovernmental organization which was established in the framework of Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 1974 to help countries collectively respond to the oil supply disruptions. So basically, OECD is an organization of mostly developed countries in the world, and in 1974 they had set up the IEA. Now, why IEA was set up is effectively there was an oil crisis in 1973. OPEC countries decided to unilaterally increase the prices of oil. Now, this obviously had a negative impact on all the other governments in the world. So these governments came together and they formed the International Energy Agency so that you could collectively respond to such oil supply disruptions. So this 1973 event is known as the first oil shock that the world has seen. Okay. Now, the IEA, you should know, is headquartered in Paris. Then to become a member of the IEA, obviously, then you have to be a member or country of the OECD. Now, since India is not a member country of the OECD, India is not a direct member of the IEA. So IEA has 30 member countries and 8 associate countries. Now, India is one of the associate members and it became an associate member in 2017. Okay. Now, this report that we want to discuss here is the World Energy Outlook. It is the flagship publication or the main publication of the IEA, and it basically gives out comprehensive view of how the global energy system could develop in the coming decades. So it analyzes what has happened in the past few years. It looks at present policies, and it also gives a sort of an overarching such a structure or an architecture to the energy system in the coming decades. So the World Energy Outlook has made some interesting observations, but vis-a-vis to the world and particularly to India, and that's something we'll be looking at here. Okay, so let's look at the main points of the World Energy Outlook. Now, obviously, as expected, because of the impact of COVID-19, there was a 5% decline in global energy demand. Now, another very interesting thing that we have seen and that the IEA through its World Energy Outlook has come up with is that now there is a renewed or a strong focus on renewables. Now, the idea is that from 2020 onwards, for the next 2 decades, whatever will be the growth in the total energy demand in the world, 90% of that growth will be matched by renewable sources. Now, for the first time, and then this has been seen by this continued high levels of push in solar photovoltaic cell development. So if you look at India, if you look at any developing countries in the world, or even the most developed countries, they are providing subsidies for solar energy. They are giving production link incentive schemes for production of solar panels, etc. And they're reducing all sorts of taxes so that people are incentivized to use solar power energy cells to meet their energy consumption requirements. Now, interestingly, because of this stricter push, there um, the prediction is that by 2040, coal's share in global energy demand will be below 20%, which is something which is going to happen for the first time in modern energy history, right? So then the report points out to a structural fall in global demand. So governments across the world have come out with policies that they want to reduce the role of, that want to, let's say, phase out coal completely. Okay. And therefore, because of these policies, there has been a retirement of 275 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity worldwide by 2025, right? So if you compare it to the 2019 level, by 2025, this would amount to a 13% reduction in coal energy. Now, coal energy is one of the most polluting forms of energy, and it releases high and huge amounts of carbon dioxide, which, as you would know by now, is highly responsible for climate change. Okay. Now, another very interesting thing that this report has pointed out, it's that it said that in a lot of developed countries, the developed countries are focusing towards renewable energy. Most renewable energy sources are more expensive than non-renewable sources. So even though a lot of developed countries have reduced demands of oil, etc., it is being more than offset by an increasing demand from low income countries, because in low income countries you're seeing a lot of development and higher disposable income with people, and therefore the energy demands of the emerging economies like India, South Africa, Mexico, etc., have continued to increase. Okay. Now let's look at points which are more specific to India. Let's look at India's energy outlook. So the first thing that this report talks about is the electricity access. So as you would have figured out by now, Government of India has been supporting expansion of distribution of grid infrastructure across the country, and we want to go for 100% electrification. Now, if you look at rural areas, the central government is providing grants to central discoms. Discoms are basically distribution companies whose job is to distribute electricity to people, and they are responsible for the last mile connectivity and delivery of electricity to household. Okay, so under the Deen Dayal Upadhyaya Gram Jyoti Yojana, grants are being provided to state discom. Then you have your integrated power development scheme, which is similar to the grants, which is similar to the DDU Gram Jyoti Yojana, except the integrated power development scheme is for urban areas. So the government is promoting more and more and cheaper access to electricity. Now, another point that we want to discuss here is cleaner energy. Now, India is pushing to be a global leader in cleaner energy, and India is there is a huge shift towards photovoltaic cells, etc. If you've been following current affairs for the last 2-3 years, you would realize that India, in partnership with France, is also a founder of the International Solar Alliance. So the point of International Solar Alliance is to promote the use of photovoltaic cells within the tropical countries. So the countries that lie between the tropics obviously have the most incidence of solar energy. Now, if you could place and develop a lot of solar power photovoltaic cells in these regions which anyways get a lot of sun, you could then somehow reduce your energy demand from non-renewable sources. So India has been doing a good job both domestically and internationally. Okay. Now, similarly, this also talks about how India is promoting global affordability. So one of the things that you should remember is that the government has started a PAHEL scheme, which is a direct benefit transfer of the LPG scheme. So let's say you and I buy cylinders out in the market, right? And you are entitled to certain subsidies. Now, instead of following a long drawn out process as it used to be earlier, you will buy the cylinder at market prices, and then the government will send money into your specific bank account as a form of direct benefit transfer of the LPG subsidy. So you should be in the know of this PAHEL scheme. Okay. Now, the report has also commended the sort of significant process that India has made in sustainable development. Okay. So now, yeah, there are these 16 sustainable developmental goals known as the SDGs of the United Nations. You should please try to read them. You should have an idea about all the 16 SDGs, because that could very well be a question, right? Let's say, for example, let's say there is a question on energy supply, and the question that could be asked to you very well is that which of the or Sustainable Developmental Goal dash talks on delivering energy access. So you should know that it's the Sustainable Developmental Goal 7, which focuses on delivering energy access. So please try to have an idea about the sustainable developmental goals. Okay. Now, another very interesting thing that we have seen is that the energy demand and emission intensities of India's GDP have decreased by more than 20% in the last decade. So, the last 10 years, our energy emission intensity has reduced by 20%. Okay. Now, under the Paris Climate Accord, there is a concept of NDC, or the nationally determined contribution. So, instead of uh, other countries deciding how much a country should contribute to the fight of climate change, the incentive is and the onus is now on the countries to decide their own targets. So India has, under its own NDCs, we have set a very ambitious target. The target is to reduce the share of non-fossil based capacity in electricity mix by more than 40%. So India targets and India hopes that by 2030, 60% of our energy demand will come from renewable energy sources. Similarly, we've also given an ambitious target that the emission intensity of its GDP would reduce by 33 to 35% by 2030. Now, recently, Mr. Javadekar, I think in November 2020, had also said, our Minister for renewable energy had said that India is very well on the path of achieving this target. Okay, so emission intensity is basically intensity per unit of GDP. So there are two ways of reducing emission intensity. Either you reduce the net, you reduce the absolute emission, or you increase the GDP so much that there is a downfall in you basically, whenever you increase the denominator, the net result is smaller, right? So if you increase the GDP, then your emission intensity will automatically be lower. Okay. Now, Government of India has also said that we will generate 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022. So that year is approaching. Most likely, because of the pandemic, we will be shifting this goal by a little. Okay. Now, another very interesting thing that Government of India has done is that the government has said that after 2027, we are not going to sanction any new coal power plant. So if there is a coal power plant right now in India, which is being constructed, obviously a lot of money has been spent there. We will construct these coal power plants, but after 2027, we will not construct any new power plant. And at the same time, the government aims to reduce or eliminate the most inefficient coal plants in the country. Okay. Second. Question is, how can we increase the GDP so much? So that's a very interesting question. We'll probably, it's outside the scope of this class. There are a lot of things that you can do for increasing GDP. You can reduce taxes, or you could borrow and make a lot of public sector investment, etc. All of that is something that the government should be concerned with. If this exam had a mains component, in the sense that if you had to write answers, then I would probably discuss how to increase GDP with you. But since it's going to be an objective type question paper, how to increase GDP of India is something which will be beyond your syllabus and beyond the scope of the discussion for this video. Okay, you can probably like send me an email or something, and we can have a discussion later at length. Okay. Okay, so in October, generally the Nobel Prizes are given. 1 second. Okay, let's talk about achieving GDP later. Okay, we'll probably discuss this after class. Great. I mean, obviously, it's going to be a challenge to achieve these goals. By the way, we were supposed to be a 5 trillion economy also in 2022, but governments a lot of times they promise the world and they're not able to deliver. So as I said, these are nationally determined contributions. The government of India itself has put this large onus on itself, and it has said that okay, we will generate so much of renewable energy, we will reduce our GDP emission intensity by so much. So these are targets that the government of India had itself given. Now, hopefully, the government of India has plans to ensure how it's going to do that. And if it doesn't, there's no sanction as such, right? Because these goals were given by us. And one of the main criticisms of the Paris Climate Agreement is that if you do not, let's say, match up what you say, and if you do not do your share and your fair bit for the world, there is no sanction mechanism. Nobody can punish you. Okay, so that's one of the issues with the Paris Climate Agreement. Since there is no permission, there's no punishment. A lot of governments have gone ahead and have given and adopted very ambitious targets. It's highly unlikely that any of the governments are going to fulfill the sort of targets that they've given. But it's always generally good TV and good press to give ambitious targets, and that keeps almost everyone happy: the voters, the international community, and the governments itself. Right? So in October 2022, in October generally, we have a lot of Nobel Prizes that are given around. Now, the Nobel Peace Prize, which is the biggest prize amongst all these Nobel Prizes, was given to the World Food Program. Okay, now let's try to understand and look at what the World Food Program is. But before that, let's look at what the Nobel Peace Prize is. Okay, so there was this philanthropist, Mr. Alfred Nobel. It was his will that once he dies, there would be 4-5 categories of Nobel Peace Prizes, right? And in his will itself, he is given the criteria for selecting to whom these Nobel Peace Prizes would be given. So, one second. Let's look at Nobel Prizes first. So as I discussed, these are designated in the will of Alfred Nobel. He was a physicist, chemist, philanthropist, made a lot of money, and said that I am going to die and I really don't need this much money. Let's use this money and give grants to scientists and recognize people all across the world who are making exceptional contributions to the field of physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. Okay. So one of the things about the Nobel Peace Prize is that it's not awarded posthumously. It means that if you die and you were not given a Nobel Peace Prize, it's too bad. Like, it cannot be given to you after your death. And this award can be shared by a maximum of 3 people in one category. Okay. So Alfred Nobel specifically said that there would be these 4 institutions responsible for giving out these Nobel Prizes. So for physics and chemistry, you have the Royal Swedish Academy of Scientists for Nobel Prize. Then for physiology or medicine, you have the Karolinska Institute. Then for literature, you have the Royal Swedish Academy, which decides who to give the prize in literature. And for the Nobel Peace Prize, there is a committee of 5 persons, which is elected by the Parliament of Norway. And these people get together and decide who should be given the Peace Prize. Now let's come back to the Peace Prize. Okay. So Nobel Peace Prize has been given since March 1901, almost annually. Sometimes there are discrepancies and these award is not given. So for 2020, this award was given to the World Food Program, and the citation for its award was for its efforts to combat hunger, bettering conditions for peace in conflict affected areas, and preventing the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. Now, if you look at, so in last year's CLAT preparation, the video is available on the Project Maverick channel on YouTube. We discussed about the global conflicts that were happening in Yemen, Syria, etc. Right. So one of the biggest casualties in any of such conflict is the poor civilians. So one of the biggest problems that you face in terms of a conflict like this is hunger. Now, because armies of both the country prioritize weaponry, etc., and they prioritize fighting each other more than feeding their own population, the site of the country on which the actual battlefield exists faces a large humanitarian crisis. So one of the bodies that reduces or mitigates this humanitarian crisis to an extent is the World Food Program. Okay. So let's see what the World Food Program is. Now, it was established in 1961, and it's an intergovernmental organization, and it's a primary agency of the United Nations that works towards achieving the, as I said again, please remember the Sustainable Development Goals. So goal 2 of the Sustainable Developmental Goals is to eradicate global hunger by 2030. Now, the World Food Program is the primary implementing agency of the United Nations, which targets to eliminate global hunger by 2030. Okay. Now, currently, it is the largest humanitarian agency in the world that is fighting hunger. Now, there are obviously other agencies as well, but World Food Program is the largest. It delivers food assistance and works with communities to make sure that their nutrition is better and to build resilience to disease, death, etc. So the headquarters for the World Food Program are headquartered in Italy, Rome. Okay. Now, on an average, every year, the World Food Program, one second. So on an average, every year, the World Food Program distributes about 15 billion rations and works in 2/3 of and a large portion of its work, about 66% of these rations go to conflict affected countries. Now there are other countries where there is no conflict. Obviously there are people who are dying hungry there. They send some rations to them, but majority of their work is done in war-torn countries. So in the last few years, I guess, most of the rations would have been shipped into Syria, Yemen, etc., wherever there is a international humanitarian crisis based out of conflict. Okay. Now, the World Food Program also publishes the hunger map. So you should know about the World Food Program, when it was started, and the fact that it's a primary agency of the United Nations. Then it aims to end global hunger, which is goal 2 of sustainable developmental goals. It's headquartered in Rome and Italy, etc. And you should also know that it publishes this hunger map, which depicts the prevalence of undernourishment in the population of each country, right? So obviously, for a country like India, there are certain domestic policies that the government comes up with, certain schemes, etc., for nutrition. But obviously, the United Nations wants to monitor it at an international level. And to monitor it at an international level, it charges, or let's say, it basically makes the WFP responsible for for publishing this document known as the hunger map, which maps out the undernourishment across the world, right? So that allows other countries to see that allows countries to see that where is countries to see and check the undernourishment status in other countries. So either they can force that particular country to raise the nutrition standard by naming or shaming, or if they have enough money of their own, they can send aid to those countries, and therefore all of the countries in the UN can work together towards eliminating hunger, which is the second sustainable developmental goal. Okay. Now let's focus on the Nobel Prize in Economics. So it's shared by two US economists, Paul Milgrom and Robert Wilson, for their works on auction theory. Now auction theory is very, very relevant to India, especially in the context of the recent 4G and 5G spectrum allocations that we've seen. Now what let's look at how this particular research, for which they've been given the Nobel Peace Prize, is important. Okay. So both these guys, they got the Nobel Peace Prize for invention of new auction formats that can apply to selling of goods and services, such as radio frequencies, which just happened in India. And when a traditional auction format which would have proved difficult. Okay. So the idea generally behind any auction is that the private entities want to maximize their revenue. However, the government might have other criteria. Revenue generation se important ho sakta hai, maybe let's say accessibility to the poor. So if I am a private company, or if I'm a private person and I'm selling my car, my primary contention and my primary idea would be to sell it for the maximum amount of price, maximum amount of money that I can. But if I'm government of India, that might not, or any other government for that matter across the world, my primary priority might not be earning the most revenue. It might be something else. For example, let's say I'm government of India and I'm allocating the 4G or the 5G spectrum to the highest bidder. I can say, okay, I will give it to the highest bidder, and then you do whatever you want to do. You have given me this much amount of money. Or I can say that I will not necessarily give it to the highest bidder, but I will give it to someone who, even though that person or that company bets a little low, but that company sort of assures me that because we are giving you lesser amount, the burden on us to make profits is lesser, and therefore we will use this money to make sure that poor people in India also have access to communication technologies. Now, as government of India, this probably would be a better choice for me. Okay. So if you come specifically to spectrum auctions, before we had auctions, we used to have a licensing system, right? And it was also known as the license Raj. So basically, if I was government of India, I could give out license to any entity that I wanted. Now, obviously, there was large scale corruption and lobbying there because there was no transparency. Now, with the influx or the entrance of auction in spectrum allocation, there was a large, let's say, there was an increase in the sort of transparency that we could see. Okay. Now let's look at what this auction theory is. So at a very, very basic level, it's a concept of transparent allocation of resources, okay, in a free market, to make sure that the best bidder goes from free market to the best bidder, and to ensure optimum utilization of any of the resources that are being auctioned off. Okay. Now, uh, Auction theory studies four things. These is not very important for you: how they are designed, what rules govern the auction, how bidders behave, and what sort of outcomes are achieved through auction. This sort of is not very relevant for you. But let's look at the benefits of auction theory. So first, it helps to choose the best design or the format for auctions for various goods and services. And it also helps to understand why governments across the world should not put a lot of emphasis on maximizing revenues. There are a lot of other things that the government could focus on. Okay. Say, for example, in auctions, for explanatory purposes, this will never be asked you. In auctions, there is something known as the winner's curse. Now, because I want to win an auction, I want that spectrum. Just because I really want to win it that bad, I might bid at a larger, as in I might bid a larger amount. So let's take a very simple example of, let's say, um, spectrum options. Let's say I have a corpus of 50 rupees and I'm willing to only pay 50 rupees. But I also realize that somebody has a corpus of 55 rupees and that person is willing to pay 55 rupees. What I would generally do is I would bid 60 even though I cannot, because I really want to get this spectrum. Now, even though I win the auction by putting a bid of 60 rupees, I'm actually the loser, right? Because I don't have the sort of resources to generate enough revenue for my auction bid to be profitable. But just because I didn't want to give this option or this part of the spectrum to somebody else, I overbid. And this is known as the winner's curse. So if you study auction theory, etc., in detail, which will never be asked to you in CLAT, you would sort of understand what are the intricacies that are involved in an auction process, right? So if you look at the IPL auction also, for example, the reason why IPL auctions are so exciting and so fair right now is because they take in a lot of, let's say, the studies that these people have conducted in their idea of auction theory. Okay. So now let's look at the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. So Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded to these two people, Emmanuel Carpentier and Jennifer A. Doudna, for discovering CRISPR-Cas9 genetic scissors. Okay. Now, CRISPR-Cas9 has been in the news for the last couple of years. For example, last year, there was a scientist in China who used the CRISPR-Cas9 scissors to edit the genetic material of newborn babies. Now, which led to a raging ethical debate, right? Now, he said that he's protecting them from some sort of inherited diseases. But the problem is that since he edited some of those genes, nobody knows what could be the adverse outcome. Now, this person was also jailed in China for a couple of years. Now let's focus more specifically on this research. So they discovered a bacteria known as Streptococcus pyogenes. Now this bacteria causes a lot of human diseases like skin infections or any other life-threatening systemic diseases. Now in this bacteria itself, they discovered a molecule known as the tracer RNA. Okay, now tracer RNA is a part of the bacteria's immune system and it helps the bacteria to destroy the DNA of the host cell by acting as a pair of scissors. Now, what these two people did was they were able to recreate bacteria scissors in the tracer RNA molecule, and they can now manipulate and reprogram these scissors to cut any sort of DNA molecule at a required site, right? So because they have developed these technologies to a large extent, they can now recreate this this scissor, and this scissor can now edit the DNA of any of the host sites. So this is how you are able to have genetically modified organisms and crops, etc. Right? So in basic scientific research, it has allowed companies and scientists to develop crops that can withstand molds, pests, and droughts, etc. Because they alter the genetic pattern of these crops. Now, similarly, there are a lot of new cancer therapies are underway, and so see, cancer, if you understand it a little bit, is basically uh, a mutation of the RNA or a DNA structure of the cell, and then that mutation keeps on multiplying. So let's say you are able to perfect the CRISPR-Cas9 genetic scissor technique, then you can go to the cancerous site, you can chop off the DNA in between and prevent that site from expanding. So it's possible that the cure for cancer might come out of the CRISPR-Cas9 genetic scissors, right? So therefore, the Nobel Peace Prize for Chemistry this year becomes very important because this will be able to solve one of humanity's greatest problems. And if this experiment is successful, maybe in future people will not inherit diseases, right? Let's say I am a person who somehow hypothetically has diabetes. So it's very likely that my offspring will also have diabetes. However, if by the time I have offspring and by the time you guys have offsprings, maybe the scientific techniques for CRISPR-Cas9 scissors would have become so generic and so cheap that anybody could use this. And now I can use the CRISPR-Cas9 scissors to eliminate that those strands of DNA that cause inherited diabetes. So I can ensure that by spending some money, it will not be free, of course, by spending some money, I am able to protect my offspring from diseases that they can inherit from me. So this can change how humanity exists, and it can change and significantly alter the disease burden that humanity has. Okay, so therefore this Nobel Peace Prize in chemistry this year is very, very important, and I expect certain questions out of this. Now, the next prize that we want to talk about is the Nobel Peace Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Now, this was shared by three people, Harvey Alter, Charles Rice, and Michael Houghton. They basically discovered the hepatitis C virus. Now, hepatitis is an inflammatory disease of the liver. Now, obviously, alcohol problem, infections, toxins, substances, etc., they cause hepatitis, but the primary cause and the most infectious cause is the hepatitis virus. Okay. Now, the last thing that I want to discuss, last two things that I want to discuss here is the Nobel Peace Prize in Physics. Okay, so this was awarded to Roger Penrose, Reinhard Genzel, and Andrea Ghez. Now, as I told you, right, Nobel Peace Prize can only be given to a maximum of 3 people. So this is for furthering the understanding of black holes. Now, these people had written papers in 1960s, etc., and they had started talking about black holes from 1960s, and later we observed black holes. Then we also had the discovery of gravitational waves about a decade or so ago, which proves Einstein's general theory of relativity, right? So for the lifelong work in the field of black holes, and for giving enough data and postulating enough theories, and for researching enough so that we understand what black holes are, these people are awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Physics. Now, if you do not have an idea of what black holes are, please Google it a little. It's a very interesting phenomenon. Basically, we've all grown up studying science, right? We've all grown up studying the 3 laws of physics, Newton's laws of physics. Now, the beauty of a black hole is that black hole is so different from anything observed in the space that even known laws of nature, for example Newton's laws of physics, stop working inside black holes, and that's what makes black holes very interesting and something which confuses a lot of people. And so these 3 people have been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in Physics to make sure that because they put in a lot of research, and now we have a better understanding of what black holes are. Okay, so the last topic for today is the Nobel Peace Prize in Literature. It was given to this lady known as Louise Gluck. Now, the Nobel Peace Prize is not given for one particular book. Okay, the Nobel Peace Prize is generally given to established writers and authors who published a lot of books across their lifetimes. Okay, so Gluck is the first female poet to win this Nobel Peace Prize, since another woman, who was Wisława Szymborska, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for Literature back in 1996. Okay, one second. Black hole like a parallel universe? No, this is not Marvel. Like, there is no Thanos here. So there is nobody knows what black holes are, but it is highly unlikely that black holes are a door or a dimension to a parallel universe. वो Marvel or DC universe में होता है. Most likely that is not the case. Okay. So that's pretty much it that we had to discuss for this class today, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Okay. Anybody has any questions, you can let me know. I'm waiting for a bit. Cool. I hope there are no questions. Thank you.